Red for danger. It took Andy Stone just over 4 months to find out where his brother Jeff had been taken by the Daleks. 4 dangerous months of hiding by day and travelling by night, not very much to eat, and sometimes, much to Andy's disgust, even having to run away from the enemy. One unarmed man can't do very much against a whole race as alien and powerful as the Daleks. Andy managed, somehow, to restrain his natural urge to get out into the open and fight. Time and time again he'd hide himself up a tree and looked down on a group of Daleks gliding along beneath him, or conceal himself in some deserted, half-ruined house and see the invaders nearby, and, on these occasions, every nerve in his body cried out to him to jump out and smash those inhuman machines. 100 schemes would run through his brain for defeating Daleks, from the digging of pit traps to blowing up some of the giant dams of Venus and drowning them. But all these thoughts really did was keep Andy's mind alert, because there was always that cautious part of him that made his search for his brother and sister the really important aim. "If I can find Jeff and Mary," he'd whisper to himself, "we can all plot and plan together to get the Daleks off Venus. So, no heroics for you, my lad, until I find the other 2. He nearly missed Jeff, as it was. A dying man he'd found on Major Road 8, near the big lead works, muttered a few words before he died, which totally baffled Andy. The old man had been with a working party of slave labour, maintaining the new metal roadway the Daleks were laying all over the surface of the planet Venus. Because he was old and weak, the Daleks had simply abandoned him and left him by the roadside to die of hunger and thirst. Andy found him in the last stages of exhaustion, some 4 days after the Daleks had left. After making him as comfortable as possible, and pouring a few drops of water at a time into the dying man's mouth, Andy gently described Jeff and started to ask whether he'd seen anything of his brother. The man nodded and said, "The Daleks melting." Then the old man fell back and his eyes closed. The Daleks melting, thought Andy. What did it mean? What else was the old man going to say? He decided to go in search of the working party and started off heading west, after he had given the old man as decent a burial as he could. What were the Daleks melting? Andy could only imagine it must have something to do with the metal roads. 10 miles on, he stopped suddenly and literally clutched a hand to his head. The old man hadn't said melting at all. He'd said smelting. Jeff had been taken to the smelting works, which Andy remembered were 20 miles or so to the east. The more he thought about it, the more he knew he was right. Lead mines were particularly rare on Venus, and the largest by far, with giant refining and smelting works, was within easy reach. And also, to add strength to it all, Jeff was a mineralogist. The Daleks must have discovered this and decided to take Jeff from menial work and put his brain to work. 2 days later, Andy wormed his way past the huge hoist houses over the lead mine shafts, safe in the knowledge that he had plenty of cover to help him elude the ever-watchful eyes of the Guardian Daleks roaming about. It was a depressing scene that greeted his eyes as he paused by a line of jet ore cars, standing empty and ready to file their smooth way down into the caverns of the ground. The Daleks were absolutely pitiless in the manner that they worked the Venusians. Gangs of people were herded and bullied into keeping the production at full blast for all of the 23 3/4 hours of the Venus day. The rest periods seemed to be totally unplanned, and only occurred when the Daleks could neither threaten nor force the people into working any longer. Andy held his anger as much as he could. I must find Jeff, he told himself. Otherwise, I'm going to pick up one of these electromagnetic drills and start a little war all of my own. He slunk about in the shadows of the ore cars, fretting impatiently at the delay. Finally, he took a chance and scrambled a dangerous route towards the laboratory building where he felt Jeff would be. About 10 yards from the squat, ugly building, he was forced to stop and then approach under the cover of a disused gyratory crusher. Outside the laboratory, he could see a long line of Daleks moving slowly forwards into the building through the double doors. What fascinated him was seeing a Dalek come out of the building coated with dull red paint. I had no idea the Daleks went in for fashion, he muttered to himself. Anyway, there's no way in by the doors, not with all those standing about ready to burn me into a cinder. He examined the building carefully and spotted a little window on the roof. He moved behind the gyratory crusher and searched around to see how free his movements would be. Night on Venus falls quickly, and the Daleks were beginning to turn on their big searchlights to ensure no interruption of the working schedules. Barring accidents, he could move unseen. Why should the Daleks imagine anybody would be foolish enough to clamber up a piece of broken-down machinery like the crusher? But that's precisely what I'm going to do, he said softly. He took another look around him and then started up the metal. There were plenty of foot and handholds, and he quickly reached the top. Now he had a good view of his section of the lead works. He was 30 feet above the ground, and the roof of the laboratory was a 10-foot jump. Easy, he told himself, providing I can hold on when I land, and as long as I don't wake up the whole neighborhood. Fortunately, the crusher leaned rather drunkenly towards the laboratory, so there was no real problem about distance. Only height. And he wasn't one to miss his chances by thinking too much about all the things that could go wrong. He took a deep breath and launched himself into the air. They say fortune favors the brave. Just as he was in mid-air, a strange, high-pitched siren began to whine out, and Daleks, who had been queuing their way into the laboratory, began to disperse. Obviously, some rest period was being ordered, thought Andy. It was all the time he had to think anything. For the next second, his feet landed on top of the roof, and his hands found and clutched onto a ledge on the roof. He lay still. The siren finally whined down into silence. Andy peered over the edge of the roof and watched the Daleks gliding away. He wormed his way over to a little skylight, peered down, and nearly shouted in excitement. He could see Jeff looking up at him from the room below, his legs chained to the floor. Andy opened the little window, then dropped noiselessly to the floor. Immediately, Jeff put a finger to his lips. The two brothers shook hands silently, and Jeff bent his head close to Andy's. "There's a Dalek on guard outside the door," he whispered. "Can I hide in here somewhere?" Jeff pointed to a long, low table covered with scientific apparatus. The cloth on it nearly reached the ground. Andy nodded. It wasn't the safest place on Venus, but there was no reason why the Dalek should start looking underneath tables. He bent down and examined the chains around Jeff's legs. The chains simply wound around each ankle and were then stapled to the floor. "There was no point in wrenching them out until I felt I could get well away," said Jeff. "But now you're here, I can do it." "Have you got a plan?" Jeff grinned. "You've no idea just how hard it's been, Andy," he said quietly. "There's a chemical over there, just out of reach. Pass it to me, and I'll have us both out of here." Andy tiptoed across the room and pulled down the bottle Jeff had indicated. It was marked sodium azide. He was about to take it to his brother when Jeff hissed a warning, and Andy, just in time, slipped under the table as a Dalek came through the door. "What were you talking about?" intoned the Dalek with its metallic voice. Its eye stick ranged over Jeff's body, and Andy could see its gun stick raising slightly and aiming at the center of Jeff's chest. "I often talk to myself," remarked Jeff carelessly, "especially when I'm hungry." "Food will be brought to you," said the Dalek flatly. "You will proceed with the treatment of the Daleks." "I'm just about to make a new batch now," replied Jeff. The Dalek slid from the room, and Andy scrambled from his hiding place and put the bottle on the table in front of his brother. "What are you working on here?" he asked curiously. "Red lead is a standard protective coating," said Jeff. "The air on Venus is moist, and the Daleks are constantly fighting rust. My job is to make up the red lead paint for the lead mine Dalek Guardians. In time, this whole place will be a huge red lead factory to supply the whole planet." "How can you get out of here with this?" said Andy, tapping the bottle. "You get back under that table before my food comes, and leave the rest to me." The next 7 or 8 hours were almost unbearable for Andy. Time to time he emerged from his cramped hiding place to stretch his legs and share Jeff's meager food rations. But apart from this diversion, it was a boring wait and very uncomfortable. Jeff worked non-stop at his bench, and into every can of red lead paint Andy could see his brother add a small quantity of very fine crystals. The strong sun of Venus was blazing through the skylight window when the ugly whine of the siren started again, only this time it kept stopping and starting. Andy guessed, rightly, that it was a call to assemble the Daleks into their queue again outside the laboratory for their coats of protective paint. He heard a Dalek move into the room. "I'm ready now," he heard Jeff say in a tired voice. "I shall need all the men you can spare." "Why?" the Dalek grated. "Because," Jeff replied patiently, "there's no point in painting Daleks one at a time. Let's get it all done in one job." There was a pause as the Dalek considered. "Very well," it said eventually, and Andy heard it leave the room. He poked his head out. "I've already painted 4 Daleks," said Jeff, "with the ordinary red lead, but I have a feeling they're going to be too concerned over the companions to worry about us. As soon as all the paint has been collected, you can pull these chains off, and we'll watch the fun from the roof." Andy refrained from asking questions and went into hiding again. Shortly afterwards, the mine workers began to troop into the room to collect the paint Jeff had prepared and take the tins outside to the waiting Daleks. As the last one left, Jeff whispered to Andy, who crawled across the room, wrenched out the staples, and unwound the chains from Jeff's ankles. Jeff spent a minute or two rubbing circulation back, and then climbed onto Andy's shoulders and pulled himself up to the skylight. Once there, he sat astride it, stretched down his hand. Andy took a running jump and managed to grasp his brother's wrist. For seconds they hung like that, hands gripping wrists. Then Jeff began to heave himself slowly backwards until Andy could bend his legs upwards, and Jeff could pull him up through the skylight. They rested a second or two before stretching themselves flat out on the roof to look down on the scene below. The men had made short work of their painting, and the last Dalek was nearly finished. "What did you do?" demanded Andy. But Jeff shook his head and pointed. The last Dalek began to move off to join others resting quietly, waiting for the paint to dry. There was a pause of about 5 minutes, and then Andy saw Daleks start to weave from side to side slightly. A kind of moaning sound filled the air, and the movements of the Daleks began to get jerkier and more erratic. "What's happening to them?" he cried. Jeff said, "We'll be able to leave soon. Let's make sure that the unharmed Daleks are well and truly occupied." They watched as 4 Daleks began to converge on the moaning, jerking group of Daleks. It was rather like a dreadful sort of dance, with the newly painted Daleks swaying about, stopping, then moving on again. All the time, the moaning sounds they made became louder and louder. Jeff chuckled. "All right, Andy. I think we can get away now." They crossed to the other side of the building, dropped down to the ground, and raced to the cover of the surrounding forest. 20 minutes later, they were beyond danger and seated quietly beside a stream in which Jeff bathed the ankles that had been chained up for so long. "Now perhaps you'll explain," said Andy, his curiosity bursting. Jeff waggled his legs in the cool water and sighed contentedly. "Well, of course I had plenty of lead salt. That stuff you handed me in the bottle. That was sodium azide, yes, I know. But what, Jeff? What did it do to the Daleks?" Jeff said, "Together, those two things make lead azide, a powerful detonator. PBN6, to give it its chemical formula, only comes in a very fine crystal. Of course, I only added a very small amount, about half an ounce to every quart of lead paint. I also added another substance to the crystals themselves, a sort of temporary coating, like a shell, so that it wouldn't work too quickly." "What would work quickly?" demanded Andy. "Well, imagine these little crystals, Andy, liable to explode on fracture. As the paint hardened in the sun, the surface contracted slightly and broke those little crystals so they began to explode, each one a tiny little explosion, and all going off at different times." "Marvelous, Jeff! So that's why they were weaving about like that?" "Yes, and moaning too. What I had sprayed all over them was only a temporary irritation, of course. But do you know, I think the effect would be like having a very nasty headache." They laughed. Jeff put on his shoes and socks. Jeff said, "Come on, let's go and find Mary. Then the 3 of us can dream up something much worse than a headache for the Daleks." And they set off through the forest.